Hey everyone, I'm Sean Deveney from Heavy.com Sports. I've got our NBA insider with me. That's Steve Bulpett. Hey Steve, how are you this morning?
Like usual, living the dream.
And speaking of dreams, we've got the Celtics and the Warriors starting the NBA Finals. I think as far as the NBA goes, this is a pretty nice finals for the broadcasters. I think there's going to be a lot of interest, a lot of star power, sort of the old guys against the new guys. So I think a lot to sell for the NBA here. But I want to go back a couple of years, Steve, to 2018 when the Celtics were about 10 minutes away from making a surprise run to the NBA Finals. They finally lost to the Cavaliers, where they just couldn't score in that fourth quarter. That would have been an interesting series, and it might have been one that powerhouse Warriors team didn't really want.
Yeah, we've got a story that'll be posting soon that basically speaks to that. That's the Warriors were much happier to be playing the Cavaliers that year, and they proved it by sweeping them in the finals. But the Warriors have been concerned for a while about the Celtics' size at the wing position and ability to switch most everything, and that since 2018, the Celtic defense has only improved in its ability to deal with a team like the Warriors, because now you've got Marcus Smart starting at point guard instead of a Kemba Walker or a Kyrie Irving or a Terry Rozier. So they're able to be bigger at that spot as well, and they can't really try to hunt the mismatch with the smaller, the really small player.
Yeah, and that's something that the Warriors, if you look at the numbers and who they played to this point, that they haven't really had to deal with the team that can switch. Really the last time they had to deal with that was the series they had in the Western Conference Finals in 2018, which they nearly lost to the Rockets, and at that time, of course, they had Kevin Durant. So if you're getting switches, then you still have that security blanket of Kevin Durant getting an ISO. They don't have that anymore. So this defense is something that the Warriors have not seen a lot of in the playoffs to this point. How do they handle that, and what are some things they can do to still put points on the board?
Well, it's harder to move the ball against a switching defense, but the Warriors are the best in the league at it. So, there's that. And they'll still put pressure on the Boston defense for that ability alone. And there's, add to that the fact you've got a number of guys on the Warriors who can just get hot at a certain time. And offense will always have an advantage over the defense. An offensive player will always have an advantage over a defensive player, if only for the fact that the offensive player is supposed to know what he's going to do before the defensive player knows what the offensive player is going to do. So, you could defend the hell out of the Warriors, and they could still hit a bunch of threes in your face against really good defense and render whatever you're trying to do schematically or just individually in terms of physical gifts defensively. They can render that moot.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we see so often, and it frustrates. Dallas is a good defensive team, for example, where you can play good defense against the Warriors for 16 or 18 seconds. You let your guard down, and with 4 or 5 seconds on the clock, and you give up a three, and the 16 seconds that you just played good defense is all for naught. And the Warriors. That's one of their advantages, not only in getting points at that moment, but also they seem to demoralize teams that way as well.
Yeah, I don't know if there's if it's on the second spectrum analytics, but I'd like to see an analysis of how a Warrior opponent's shoulders slump after Steph Curry puts one in their mug, or Jordan Poole, or Mr. Thompson. That's they have the guys that can frustrate you, and they've got guys that can beat closeouts too now. I mean, Wiggins is going to be tough in this series. There's a lot of guys who could be sneaky good in this series on both sides.
And I think one of those guys, especially with the way the Warriors they cut more than any team in the league. I think that could really be an opportunity in a way for Robert Williams to shine and to really show just what a terrific presence he is in the middle. As the Warriors find these different ways to get to the basket, we've seen Robert Williams really be a deterrent down there. How important is he in terms of his health and what we've seen to this point? And do you think that with the extra days off, he's going to be good to go in all these games?
That last part, I don't think anyone's certain. I don't even think that the Celtics medical people can be certain of that. But I think he's hugely important. Like you said, getting stuff, stopping things at the rim. But maybe even more important, as the defense is switching, if the Warriors get the Celtics in rotation, Robert Williams' ability to switch out onto a shooter to close out to a three-point shooter is, certainly the best of any big man in the league, perhaps. But you saw him blocking three-pointers in the last couple series.
Yep.
That's big. And, it's one more way that the Celtics can get in the way of the Warriors' incredible unselfishness. I mean, it's the way the Warriors play when it's going right is beautiful basketball. I don't care if you love or hate three-pointers. Seeing the ball move like that and seeing guys, that kind of clockwork on offense is beautiful stuff.
And I think another guy who you mentioned, Williams, I think another guy will be key to the Celtics defense, and we've talked about him plenty before, Steve, is Derek White. He's very good at guarding away from the ball and getting in the way of screens and getting in the way of cutters and things like that. Inconsistent offensively. Certainly, we've seen more from him in the last few games. I think he's been more willing to, rather than just be a spot up 3-point shooter, to attack the basket and use. He's got a great floater when he wants to use it. Where do you see him in this series, and does he really even need to make that many shots to be effective with the way that he can defend off the ball?
No, I mean he's got to keep offensively. He needs to be able to keep the defense honest. And it's not necessarily if he's getting an outside shot in rhythm, you'd like it to go in if you're the Celtics. But if it's in rhythm, that means you've got good floor balance, and your guys are not going to get beat going the other way, and you might have a chance to keep a ball alive for an offensive rebound. A guy like Rob Williams is huge in that regard. But yeah, I think his defense. Well, what it allows is the Celtics should have a size advantage in this series. But in situations where they decide to go smaller and perhaps match what the Warriors are doing, going smaller is not going to hurt them. Okay, and I think it gives more opportunities. I think a guy that I think should see some run in this series, and the Celtics are kind of lucky they didn't need him in the last series because I'm not sure he was ready because of the way the Celtics work their rotation, is Peyton Pritchard. He barely saw the floor toward the end of the series against Miami. And I'm thinking, if all of a sudden something happens and they need him, I'm not sure he's going to be ready, to just pop in the game and hit a couple of shots. With shooters, you've got to make sure they get their touches. You've got to give them their opportunities. And I think, if you look at one thing over the year that hasn't been one of the better things that MA's done is that he hasn't, engendered that much confidence in those guys. After the trade deadline deals, Peyton Pritchard did get to see the floor more, and you saw the reward of that. And it's hard when you're in a playoff series and you want to shrink your rotation because, you're not necessarily playing for the next game. You're playing for what's in front of your face right now. So I think that'll be interesting to keep an eye on that aspect of how deep the Celtics go in their rotation, whether they match up small against the Warriors' smaller lineups too.
Yeah, seven-man rotation really for the last 3 games of that Miami series. And we did see Pritchard certainly against Milwaukee and some of those earlier games against Miami have some pretty good games. And any insights as to why or what your opinions as to why Pritchard sort of fell out of that rotation there in those last 3 games?
I think, you get a little nervous with your rotation, or you get a little nervous with what's going in. If something's working a little bit, you try to stick with it more. I think that's I think what we saw during the year, especially early, when the Celtics were playing guys and they were, essentially burying Peyton Pritchard and even Aaron Nesmith, who's, forget about him right now.
Right.
He can come in and give you some defense, but I don't think the Celtics have invested enough minutes in him right now to make him that they should expect he can come into a game and hit a bunch of shots. Where I think that's where he could be in his career right now, if given the opportunities. So I think it's you're maybe a little too cautious, or you're but being this cautious has got him this far, so it's hard to argue with the results.
Yeah, and I think we can kind of flip that on the other side too and look at the Warriors rotation, because I think Steve Kerr has some interesting decisions. We have to see who's healthy, first of all. Andre Iguodala, Gary Payton Jr., Otto Porter Jr. Those 3 guys really weren't available much in the last series. Iguodala not at all, and of course, Payton with that nasty elbow injury against in the second round against Memphis. So those 2 guys didn't play at all against Dallas, and Porter didn't play in the last 3 games. He's got a foot injury. Do you expect, and if you're Steve Kerr, would you look to get those guys back in the rotation? It's tough to knock the rust off in the NBA Finals. Is that a dangerous game for Steve Kerr to try to work these guys back in the rotation? And do they need to? With the team they've got and the days off they've got, how many of these guys do they really need?
Well, the question is, how do the Warriors want to attack Boston? How does the Warrior defense want to attack Boston? The Celtics, if you look at one Achilles heel, it's their propensity to get flustered and bad turnovers, live ball turnovers, which are death. That kind of stuff kept Miami alive in the series. The Celtics could have closed this out much earlier, the conference finals, but they would get flustered. They would turn to hero ball. They would certainly it's defensive pressure, but even with the pressure, you can say that a lot of those turnovers were unforced or just silly turnovers. And if the Warriors choose to say, look, we're going to throw waves of bodies at these guys and keep pressure on them all the time and win that way, I could see the Warriors using a deeper rotation.
Yeah, and certainly I think with Andre Iguodala, I don't think you worry too much about him knocking off rust. I mean, he's been through this plenty of times, maybe a little more with Peyton, but again, it's not like they don't need him to make shots. They don't need him to work the rust off his offensive game. That's not really him. It's an elbow injury. It's not it's not a knee, something that affects his athleticism. So, I think he could get back on the floor and be effective defensively for the Warriors. And that kind of leads to my next question is what do the Warriors do in terms of individual matchups here? Of course, they're a switch heavy team as well. But how do they guard Jaylen Brown? How do they guard Jason Tatum? How do you see those 2 matchups and how the Warriors handle them?
Well, Miami had success throwing an extra body at those guys once the ball got on the floor. When you saw Jaylen Brown dribble into turnovers. So when those guys have it, and once they make their move to the basket, if another body comes and you force them to be a passer, that number one benefits because you're getting the ball out of the hands of Tatum and Brown, guys who can beat you. That's assuming your defense is strong enough at that point of attack to force that pass or force that turnover. And again, you you're looking at these guys. If the Celtics get down by 5 or 6 or 10 points, do they start forcing things? So I would expect that an extra body will get thrown at Tatum and Brown when they make their moves. But if they can, be better at seeing that coming, and not only being a willing passer in those situations, but making the right pass. I mean, let's go back to Tim Duncan. He didn't just make the pass out of the double team. He made the pass that killed you. And so if the Celtics are, better at that, I'm not sure what the Warriors can do defensively that will, really stifle Boston, because there are a lot of weapons on the Celtics, a lot of guys that have the ability to get hot. And, when things fail, you've got a big guy, Al Horford, that'll be on the perimeter to relieve pressure. You've got a big guy, Rob Williams, who, when guys do, when a Tatum or Brown drives to the basket and the inevitable help defense comes, if they're able to notice that, it's a big guy coming to help off me, they can just lob the ball toward the rim. And they know that, without even seeing Rob necessarily, they know they got someone there that can, turn that out of control drive perhaps, or in trouble drive into an easy deuce.
Yeah, and it's a good point about that, bringing that extra guy and having that help. So if you've got, Klay Thompson, for instance, if he's on Jaylen Brown as a primary defender, and Klay Thompson's not quite the defender that he was before all these injuries. And that's a matchup that maybe Jaylen Brown could take advantage of, unless the Warriors, as we saw the Heat do, unless the Warriors are able to, effectively get over to him and really expose some of his ball handling the way that Miami did.
Yeah, is one of the points I'm making in the column that we'll be posting soon is that, or by the time you see this, it may already be up, is that it's hard to look at this series in terms of simple matchups, because there's going to be so much switching on, both sides, both ends of the court, that, that's kind of moot. Who you're matched up with could be just a real momentary thing. And it was that way. You can say, okay, look, the Celtics want Marcus Smart to be on Steph Curry and get physical with him and try to get him off his game that way. And they can do that sometimes. But when Steph Curry, who's great at moving without the ball, like almost all the Warriors are, when he runs through 2 or 3 picks, is Marcus Smart still going to be the guy who's on him? So is that a matchup or isn't it? It's kind of, not really.
Right. So this is with both teams really. And, it is interesting because I think, the Celtics were sort of built to play this way, and Ime has kind of pushed them a little further. But, this is, this level of switching and this kind of defense is really something. Excuse me. Go back. I mean, this was the key to the Warriors 5 finals. The Celtics play the kind of defense that got the Warriors to 5 finals in a row. And it's just interesting to see that. I don't think the Celtics set out to, let's play like the Warriors, but it's kind of developed that way where, at least on the defensive end, the Celtics are sort of a mirror image of what you get with the Warriors.
Yeah, and the Celtics now, with Rob Williams, Al Horford, they're different than the Warriors used to be. You get those 2 guys versus Zaza Pachulia, or
Bogut.
Yeah. I mean, so it's different. The story that we have up on Heavy.com with Danny Ainge talking about the moves that Brad Stevens has made. He talked about the Al Horford trade, and sure, Al Horford has played great for what he's been able to do individually, hitting shots. Defensively, blocking shots even. And this guy's going to turn 36, Friday? But perhaps the biggest part of that deal from Boston is by having Al Horford to start next to Rob Williams, you take Jason Tatum and turn him from a 4 to a 3. Now he's got a size advantage there, most likely. You take Jaylen Brown and from a small forward to a two guard, and there's a size advantage, strength advantage there, most likely. So you made them a more physically important, imposing team with that deal, because it just, it changes the seats that guys are in, and changes the just in terms of maybe not the individual matchup, because like we said, teams are switching all the time, but you're going to have a bigger body. You're just going to be bigger overall, and as you switch, that has an effect.
And you mentioned Danny Ainge, and you spoke to him recently about this team and about Brad Stevens. What were some of the things you learned, and what's your impression in terms of, does he still see this as a little bit his team, as a little bit this is what I wanted when I put this group together?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I know that Danny Ainge and Brad Stevens, communicate regularly. Danny hired Brad as coach, out of Butler in 2013, and it surprised a lot of people. But there's a relationship there, and I'm pretty sure Brad has gone to Danny just particularly before Ainge signed on as CEO of the Jazz. They were probably discussing things even more then. But then again, Brad's his own guy. The Al Horford move, I think, is one that looks pretty logical. You can say, well, you're bringing in a guy that he's old and he hasn't played in a year, but Al Horford can still play. And I think they saw that enough of that last year that say, yeah. And his Horford situation in Philadelphia was something you just kind of got to wash aside, because it wasn't a realistic situation. The expectations were wrong. The way that it played out on the court, the acceptance of the rest of the Sixers to play the way they needed to play, it wasn't there yet. So that deal I can see. I'm not sure Ainge ever makes the deal for Derek White. You give up a first, you give up a pick swap, and essentially you're trading. Well, forget about Romeo Langford, whatever, who just hasn't seemed to. Who may someday blossom into a player. He certainly has the skill to be a good NBA player, a good NBA rotational player. But injuries and opportunities and all those things, he hadn't been there. So leave him aside. You had Josh Richardson versus Derek White. Josh Richardson, a better shooter, defensively, has got the length as well. I think if you look at the one advantage that a Derek White has, probably better with the ball in terms of movement and setting other people up and that ability. But I think Ainge might have stuck with Josh Richardson in that case instead of giving up a pick and the pick swap.
Yeah, and I think getting Al back, that cost them a pick as well. Who's sanguine, who's turned out
excuse me,
a pretty good prospect. You wrote about him before. And it is interesting to see, that when you go back, I went back and looked at some of the reactions to that Al Horford deal, it was sort of like, well, it's a financial benefit for the Celtics. They could not pick up his guarantee after this year. It gets them out of Kemba Walker's deal, the long-term commitment there. It was viewed when they traded for Al Horford much more from a financial lens than what he was going to be able to do on the floor.
Yeah, people just hadn't seen it, and they forgot that Al's a really good basketball player. He got criticized when he was here before the first time, and it was silly. I mean, there are subtleties to Al Horford's game that are really important to a team's makeup. We've had stories this year about the Lakers, and we had one NBA executive saying that their problem was they were playing rotisserie basketball, just trying to get together the most famous, the most starry roster, not understanding that it has to work chemically. There has to be not only chemistry in terms of people getting along, that you can live with sometimes, but you can live with some issues in that regard. But it has to work. The chemistry has to work in terms of their basketball skills. You have to have players who are complementary. And Horford's the kind of guy that will always find a way to be complementary because he's not going to demand the ball. He's not going to demand shots. He's willing to move it. He's willing to do what's necessary. And I think if there was one thing that Al didn't like doing was being the guy down low getting beat up. And by playing, that was one of the reasons I think he went to the Sixers. Number one, they gave him a lot of money. But the opportunity to play next to Joel Embiid, saying, okay, he'll take a lot of the abuse here, and I can play more of my all-around game. But being able to play next to Rob Williams has helped Al as well.
Yeah.
But, there's Al, as a safety valve on the wing, in the three-point corner, hitting shots, ball movement, going to the bucket. And, of course, defensively, things that people don't necessarily notice because they're looking for numbers and spectacular plays. Yeah, he had that great block of Max Strus in Game 7. But most often, Al's defensive strength is positioning. He shuts things off before they ever get to be an issue. Sliding over to help changes things. So, there are some subtleties to Al's game that aren't always so readily available to be recognized. But, he's real important to this team, and he can still play. And, I have every expectation that he's going to, put his feet up a lot this summer and be ready to play again next year.
And one last thing, Steve, I won't put you on the spot for a prediction, but let's just say what the Celtics will win if what happens?
The Celtics will win if they stay the course offensively. I think they can withstand the Warriors' runs, but when the Warriors make those runs, the Celtics have to stick with their offense. They have to stick with the ball movement and cutting. And that's been a problem for them all along. And it's going to be even more so in this series because the Warriors, like we talked about earlier, will hit three-pointers in your face and make your shoulders slump. Mm-hmm. If you see the Celtics' shoulders down around their ankles, that's not a good thing. But if they keep moving the ball, they will find good shots, and they will say if they're down by 10, it won't get to 20, and they'll stay in a game and give themselves opportunities. So, yeah, I think that's the big thing is avoiding turnovers, playing good, solid offensive basketball with force.
And on the flip side, the Warriors will win if
they make their outside shots and if they get Boston flustered. And they have the ability to do both.
Well, thanks a lot, Steve. Really appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for checking out Heavy.com Sports. And be sure to check out Steve's work and more over at the Heavy.com NBA.